It'll just keep winding up. What you can do for time, you can also do for space. Okay? And if you do it for space, that's called spatial summation. Now, this is not a great figure to show this, because if the thermodes were really that spread out, right, going all the way from your wrist to your elbow, spatial summation would probably not occur, right? But I think they're doing it because it's a cartoon and they wanted to make it clear that there are multiple thermodes. If you have multiple thermodes that are pretty close together and you all do them at the same time, right? Even though, technically speaking, completely different primary afferents are being activated in each case, if in fact you turn on two probes, and again, thermodes really is what probes should be. If you turn on two thermodes at the same time, you're going to get a higher VAS, 3 even higher, 4 even higher than that. So now the stimulus is summating, but in space, not in time. And that, of course, can be easily demonstrated in the laboratory as well. People started doing these experiments and found a curious thing. So there are a whole bunch of experiments where people come into the lab, and the first thing that happens is somewhere on their arm or on their leg, they're given an injury. Okay, let's say it's a little controlled burn. Okay, so just a few millimeters in diameter. So that's the red dot there, the primary zone, the site of the actual burn injury. Okay, and then, so they give you a burn, and then what they start doing is they start poking you with fibers or heat pulses, and they just map it out. And so you'll see these pictures in journal articles of, they like to use the leg because there's more space, where people have marker, black marker marks all around them. And what they do is, so they poke in a certain place, and people either say that hurt or it didn't hurt, or they give a rating that was above or below a certain threshold. And if they responded to it, they put a dot, and if they don't respond, they put an X. And eventually what they can do is they can draw a circle around all the places where people actually felt pain. Okay? And so that's what's been done here. The primary zone is in red. That's where the injury was. But in green is sort of mapped out, imagine that being on a leg, mapped out the region where, in fact, people said that stimuli hurt. Okay? But what they found was a curious thing, that it depends whether the injury is mechanical or whether the stimulation is mechanical or heat. In the primary zone, there is hypersensitivity or hyperalgesia of mechanical and heat. Okay, so if they take a noxious heat stimulus or a noxious mechanical stimulus. And again, I'm saying hyperalgesia here. This works for allodynia as well. It would have been better to call this hypersensitivity. But if it's directly in the primary zone, then there's sensitization. They give higher ratings after than before. Okay? If, however, it's in this secondary zone, which remember is uninjured tissue, it's not burned. It's away from the injury. Not forever, but away from the injury by a certain amount. What they find is that you can reliably show mechanical hypersensitivity, but not thermal. What spinal cord second-order neuron could explain the mechanical sensitivity of secondary hyperalgesia? Everyone remember? Anyone remember? Remember what the formal name of the silent nociceptors are? Low-threshold mechanosensitive, right? Those same neurons that were A-beta before injury may have now become nociceptors now, but because A-betas are interested in touch and not heat or cold, if in fact they're responsible for this secondary hyperalgesia, that would explain why it's only to mechanical. That, of course, is the leading hypothesis for why it is. Things get a little bit more complicated because even more careful work into secondary hyperalgesia has revealed that it's more that it breaks down into subcomponents. So we have another graphic here. In this case, they're showing you an extra thing. So the injury where let's say the bird injury was is now in gray in the middle. But of course, because it's an injury, there's inflammation. And you see when a part is inflamed, there's a part around the injury that becomes red. Everyone knows this, right? You get an injury, and you know where the injury is, and then for some distance around that, you see the extent of the inflammation. That's called a flare. Okay, the red part around an injury is called a flare, and so they're showing you the flare here as well. And they're showing you the extent of the flare. And so you could say, all right, well, it's not in the injury, but where the flare is, the pain might be because of the inflammation itself. But there's clearly hyperalgesia here because in the blue zone outside that, they're able to show a certain thing. And then even further around that, there's the yellow zone where they show another thing. And the properties of the blue zone, which is smaller, and the yellow zone, which is bigger, are shown in that table. And the big difference, of course, is that for the blue zone, all you really need to do is stroke lightly with a Q-tip, and you will show allodynia, dynamic allodynia. And in the yellow zone, in addition to there being dynamic allodynia, there is also punctate hyperalgesia. Okay, so this is an important thing. It's not that the blue zone is one thing and the yellow zone is only another thing. It's in the blue zone you can show dynamic allodynia, but not punctate hyperalgesia. No, sorry, the other way around. In the yellow zone, you can only show punctate hyperalgesia. As you get closer to the injury, you can show both punctate hyperalgesia and dynamic allodynia. Okay, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Right? As you go further out, you lose symptoms. Right? So in the yellow zone, there's only punctate hyperalgesia. If you poke, they'll say, ouch. If you go in further, in addition to that, you will get dynamic allodynia that you won't get in the punctate zone. In addition to that, and now small and large is obvious, central sensitization is true in both cases. In both cases, it's a while away from the injury, and it's even outside the flare. So there's nothing that can explain this other than central sensitization. And the other difference, of course, is that in the inner area, it doesn't last for very long. But the punctate hyperalgesia can go on for an hour or two after the injury. And again, I don't want to go into the details of what can explain this. There are theories. But this sort of psychophysical finding is very, very reliable. And it suggests, of course, that the biology changes from the injury to areas surrounding the injury to areas further away from the injury than that. Right? Yeah. Yeah, I know. That's a bit of a mystery to me, too, now that I read it carefully. You're right. You would expect that it would go the other way. I don't have a good answer to that. I could probably find out. So far, I've just sort of taken it on faith that secondary hyperalgesia has to be due to central sensitization. There's actually some pretty good evidence to prove the point. First, let me show you what this diagram is showing, because it's pretty interesting, right? So in so they're showing normal tissue